This meeting is being recorded.
I'm going to mute all, and then Doris, you unmute.
Okay.
Go ahead, Doris.
Okay. Good evening and welcome to the third program under the auspices of the Western PA Small Congregations Initiative, which brings together 13 congregations from the region. The conveners of this group are the Jewish Community Legacy Project, known as the JCLP, and the Jewish Federation of Greater Pittsburgh. My name is Doris Pinsky. I have the honor of serving as president of Congregation B'rith Shalom in Erie and will serve as chair for this evening's program. Tonight's program is entitled B'nai B'rith in Western Pennsylvania. I will shortly share a few words about tonight's speaker, Eric Lidji. But first, I remind you that our concluding program will feature Dr. Richard Weisberg from Beth Samuel Jewish Center in Ambridge, who will speak about Holocaust reparations. That will be held on April 27th. The registration link will be forthcoming. Tonight's program will be recorded and available on the JCLP YouTube channel. The link will be sent out after the program. Another note, please keep your audio muted throughout Eric's presentation. You can send questions and comments through the Zoom chat. It is now my pleasure to introduce you to Eric Lidji, back due to popular demand. Eric was the presenter at the first program of the Western PA Small Congregations Initiative. He spoke movingly about the spirit of the regional community. Eric is the director of the Rauh Jewish Archives at the Heinz History Center in Pittsburgh. He curates its website, the Jewish Encyclopedia of Western Pennsylvania, and hosts its local history podcast, The Cornerstone. He is the author of many books and articles on the Jewish history of Western Pennsylvania. He was kind enough to come to Erie, actually, to help us to decide what articles would be good for archives and so forth, which we really highly appreciated. It's now my pleasure to call on Eric.
Thank you, Doris. Looking out over the Brady Bunch screen of faces, I think I know most of you, and some of the rooms that you're in I even recognize, but I don't know that I know everyone. So I just wanted to start with a little bit of a background on the Rauh and what our connection is with small towns. So the Rauh Jewish Archives is the central repository for Jewish historical records in Western Pennsylvania. We were founded on November 1st, 1988. And at the time, it was called the Western Pennsylvania Jewish Archives. And that name was very deliberate because from the beginning, the archive saw itself as a regional initiative. So it was not the Pittsburgh Jewish Archives, it was the Western Pennsylvania Jewish Archives. And from the beginning, the archive always looked beyond Pittsburgh into the small towns to make sure that it was the first collections that we got as an archive, and I see Marilyn here, was from Denora. And over the years, as small town demographics changed, occasionally the archive would get offered additional collections. So over the years, we got collections from Titusville and from Rankin and from Glassport and Beaver Valley. But something changed about a decade ago. And at the time, the archive was run by Susan Melnick, who some of you may have met. And what she was starting to notice was that there was a lot more requests from small town congregations to have their materials in the archive. It increased exponentially that year in 2013 and 2014. And so she launched something called the Small Towns Jewish History Project, which was an effort to be proactive. So rather than wait for people to call us, we would start to build relationships with people in the small towns. And we would collect records, we would do oral histories, we would put exhibits online. And we really thought it was going to be a one-year project. We picked 5 congregations that first year. And then 5 became 10. And then bit by bit, we started to discover more congregations, more records that people had hidden away in their houses. And by the end of the first phase of the project, we had 60 exhibits on our website from small towns in the area. With the pandemic, things slowed down a bit, as they did with everything. But just in the last 6 months, we've really found the project starting to pick up steam again. We've received 3 congregational collections from, I believe the representatives of all the 3 congregations are here, maybe not Bradford. And starting to have some interesting ideas about where we can take the project next. And so I want to tell you all about 2 initiatives. One is something that we've announced publicly, and the other is something that you all will be the first to hear about. The one that we've announced already is that we recently started a database of yard site plaques. And many of you have already know about this because we've been in your buildings taking pictures of your yard site plaques. But what we've been doing is photographing these plaques, transcribing the English and the Hebrew, putting a database of these on our website with the photographs, connecting those back to the records of the congregations, and then sending a duplicate copy to the Jewish Online Worldwide Burial Registry run by Jewish Gen. So that ensures that those yard sites will be available worldwide in many places so that anybody can find them. We have a backlog of about 25,000 plaques that we're working through. We have volunteers doing that. And if any of you want to volunteer on that project, especially if you know Hebrew, because right now I'm the only one who's doing the Hebrew transcription. So if you know Hebrew and you'd like to help me out on that, you're welcome to. It can be done remotely. The second project that we're doing is, I've had this thought for a while, that these records of the small town congregations are a really powerful resource, because one of the big issues right now facing the Jewish community is, how do we improve our relationship with non-Jews? How do we build bridges and encourage dialogue so that they understand who we are? And I really feel like the small towns are way ahead of the curve on that, because in the small towns, the Jewish communities have always been very much minorities. There is no Squirrel Hill. And the Jews always had to learn how to interact and engage with the communities around them. And what we're working on now is a project that will allow us to take these records back out into the small towns and use them as a way to get into high schools and to historical societies, and to start opening up conversations about Jewish history, and then to build relationships between Jews and non-Jews. So we're doing a pilot project in May in a very tiny town called New Bethlehem, PA. I don't know if anybody here has been there. It's a little town outside of Clarion. And we have some records from them. And I made contact with a wonderful high school teacher up there who is a Holocaust educator. And he was very excited about this opportunity to build local Jewish history into his Holocaust curriculum, so that his students understand that it wasn't just Jews in Europe, that there were Jews in America who had family, and that it was very local to them. So I'm very excited about that. And as that project continues, I'll be reaching out to a lot of your communities for help making contacts in your town. Okay, that's enough of the business part. So one of the things that we've learned as we've been doing this project and learning more about small towns and about small towns in Western Pennsylvania in particular is that there's a different way to look at this region if you think about the small towns. And what I mean by that is, the impulse normally is to look at population centers, and that tells you where you want to focus your attention. And so for years, the way that most people looked at Pittsburgh Jewish history was they looked at the Hill District and they looked at Squirrel Hill, and everything else was a satellite of that experience. And the reason that they were focusing on those 2 neighborhoods is because that's where 75% or more of the Jewish population lived. If you look at communities instead of at individuals, the whole thing flips, because now most of the communities are not in Pittsburgh. Most of the communities are outside of Pittsburgh in the small towns. And so one of the underlying principles of the Small Towns Project has been to put a different lens on local Jewish history, to look at communities and to really make the story regional rather than a local story with satellites, to really look at Western Pennsylvania as a whole. And the story that I want to tell today about B'nai B'rith, I think in a lot of ways is very emblematic of that story. Because B'nai B'rith in a lot of ways found its fullest expression in the small towns rather than in the big city. So I want to start just with this wonderful image I found today in one of the B'nai B'rith scrapbooks. It's a partnership that B'nai B'rith did with the Heinz food company to send baby food to Israel. This was probably in the late 40s or early 50s, right when Israel first became a state. While you're looking at this, I'll tell you a little bit of the background for this project. So toward the end of, I guess it was 2021, I started thinking about all of these B'nai B'rith lodges all over Western Pennsylvania. And I had this idea of trying to make a definitive list of all of the B'nai B'rith lodges. And I didn't know how hard or easy it would be, but I ended up spending weeks on it, going through Jewish newspapers, going through records at the archives, going through any resource I could find to try to get a definitive list of all of the B'nai B'rith chapters in Western Pennsylvania. And what I found were 92 lodges, and that includes Western Pennsylvania and West Virginia. It does not include Ohio, just because Ohio was in a different district, as I'm sure many of you know. They were not in District 3. Of those 92 lodges, there were 60 cities represented. So Pittsburgh is one, and the other 59 were small towns throughout this region. It's really incredible if you think about it. 59 different cities had B'nai B'rith lodges. And many of those cities had multiple lodges. Some had 2, some of them even had 3, which means that probably 75% or more of the B'nai B'rith lodges in Western Pennsylvania and West Virginia were in small towns rather than in Pittsburgh proper. So that's the story that we're going to look at tonight. When you look down that list of the 92 lodges and you look at the years they were started and the locations of them, you start to get a history of Western Pennsylvania told through B'nai B'rith lodges. So just to show what I mean, let's start at the beginning. B'nai B'rith is notable because it is the oldest national Jewish service organization in the United States. It was founded in New York City in 1843. So what did the Pittsburgh Jewish community look like in 1843? Well, we actually know the answer to that because the Occident, which was the first Jewish newspaper in America, the first English language Jewish newspaper in America, started publishing in 1843. And in July, it published a subscriber list. So you can see where all their subscribers were living. This doesn't tell you every Jew in America, but it does tell you the ones that cared enough to be subscribers to the Jewish newspaper. And what we see in Western Pennsylvania are 5 people. So we know that in 1843, there were at least 5 Jews living in Western Pennsylvania. And right away, you can see the regional nature of the Jewish community. There's 2 people in Pittsburgh, and then there's 3 living in small towns outside of Pittsburgh, Erie, Franklin, and Meadville. And the people in Erie, Franklin, and Meadville are all related to each other, which is also something that carried through for the next century plus of Jewish life in the small towns, that there were these family networks. In 1856, by 1856, B'nai B'rith had become large enough that it started to split into districts. And so at the time, there was sort of 2 centers of gravity in the Jewish world in America. There was the East Coast around New York, and there was the Midwest around Cincinnati. And Pittsburgh was kind of this awkward thing in the middle. By 1856, Pittsburgh had the beginnings of a Jewish community. There was a cemetery, the Beis Alman Cemetery up on Troy Hill. There was a congregation. It was at that point in 1856, it was Rodef Sholem, but it had spent about a decade splitting apart and coming back together. There was a Jewish charity, and that was it. And there was probably 25 people. So we were included in this new district called District 3. And District 3 brought together 4 states that I think today we would not think of as going together. It was Delaware, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia. In 1856, West Virginia and the western half of Pennsylvania were very much frontier. And eastern Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware were much more, we would say, cosmopolitan. So it was a district that had a great imbalance to it. But over time, Western Pennsylvania starts to develop, and you start to see these lodges pop up. So these are the small town lodges that were formed between 1866 and 1871 in Western Pennsylvania. And you can see that they are all clustered up in northwestern PA. And the reason for this, as I'm sure you can all guess, is because of the oil boom. So oil is discovered in Titusville, I believe in 1859. It leads to this big rush of activity and people and money coming into these towns. There's all these towns and cities in that area that start to grow tremendously. Titusville during that period becomes the 3rd largest Jewish community in the state. So it's Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, and Titusville. Titusville had 500 Jews in the 1860s and 70s and 80s. And so very quickly, B'nai B'rith starts to move into that area. And you can see these lodges forming in these towns. I found this wonderful document on a auction site for the B'nai B'rith Lodge in Corry, PA. Corry, even though it was a tiny little town, had 2 congregations at one point. That's how dynamic the area was. There was then a big lull, and the B'nai B'rith picks up again. The next wave of B'nai B'rith lodges comes between 1901 and 1910. And the leading figure behind that is J. Leonard Levy. So Dr. J. Leonard Levy was the senior rabbi at Rauh Sholem congregation in Pittsburgh. And he was a dynamic transformational figure. He was world famous. He's not very well known today, but in his day, he was world famous. And he was an incredibly accomplished and competent person. And he really saw B'nai B'rith serving a very specific function. So this was from a sermon that he gave in 1914 called The B'nai B'rith's Opportunity. And this is from a section of that sermon called The Need for the IOBB. And he says, there are many Jews honestly opposed to Reform Judaism. Keep in mind, he's a Reform Jew. And then he says, there are many like myself who can never go back to Orthodoxy. So he had grown up Orthodox. He said, the hundreds of thousands of Israel are still attached to Orthodoxy. We ought therefore find some place where Jews of varying complexions of belief can meet for mutual helpfulness. And the B'nai B'rith serves that purpose. So what he was talking about here was the fact that in American Jewish life, there was beginning to be this split between Orthodox and Reform. Conservative was still kind of finding its footing. And at that time, that divide between Orthodox and Reform was really preventing the Jewish community from accomplishing a lot of social service needs that needed to get done. And the synagogues in particular were places that were very conflict heavy. In the cities, this could be mitigated somewhat because the populations were so large. And so if you have a place like Pittsburgh that by 1914 has tens of thousands of Jews living there, if they want to split into 2 camps, they can still get a lot done. But what was happening is that in the small towns, this divide between Reform and Orthodox was actually preventing the community from forming even the most basic communal infrastructure. And J. Leonard Levy's idea was that B'nai B'rith could be a way to sidestep that entirely, because you don't have to worry about split seating or mixed seating. You don't have to worry about English or Hebrew. You don't have to worry about what prayer book you're using. All the most complicated questions you can just put aside. B'nai B'rith was a place where Jews could come together as Jews, for social benefit, for communal benefit, for philanthropic benefit. And so he was extremely active during the first part of his tenure in forming B'nai B'rith lodges. So these are the lodges that he helped form in small towns between 1901 and 1910. You can see that it's many of the larger small towns throughout the area. And what he was doing was he would go into these towns, he would find 2 or 3 people that he felt like were solid organizers. He would give them the charge, and then they would go out into the community and start creating these B'nai B'riths. And in many of these towns, what's interesting is that the B'nai B'rith really was geared towards the Reform Jews that didn't have a home. So you think of a place like Braddock, which is listed here. Braddock had 2 Orthodox congregations back in the day. It didn't quite have a large enough Reform population to justify a congregation. Newcastle didn't get its Reform congregation until the 20s. You see Charleroi, Denora, and Monessen there. Those 3 towns always had an interesting dynamic. It ended up sort of shaking out that Denora had an Orthodox congregation and Charleroi had a Reform congregation. So what he was doing was he was going into towns that had small Reform populations and was using B'nai B'rith as a way to gain some momentum for those communities. J. Leonard Levy died somewhat unexpectedly in 1917. And a lot of this movement, but he had already kind of reached the end of his efforts in this by 1910. You can see that some of those early lodges that he helped form really became cornerstones in their communities. These are just 2 objects that I think show kind of the esteem that B'nai B'rith was held in various towns. One is the original charter from the Newcastle Lodge, which eventually became the Nathan Love Lodge, 609, I believe. And the other is from the McKeesport Lodge. It was this beautiful menorah that was commissioned by one of the members, and the congregation donated that to us a couple years ago. The third wave of B'nai B'rith lodges came in 1915, 1916, which was the beginnings of World War I, but before America got into it. Even though J. Leonard Levy was alive during this time, he did not lead this effort. It was actually led by Richard Rauh, who is one of the namesakes of the Rauh Jewish Archives. He was a young guy at the time, an advertising executive, and he was using his skills in communication to go out into these towns and to start gathering interest in B'nai B'rith. If you look through the list, you can see that some of these towns already previously had lodges. So, for example, one of the ideas that he had was starting regional lodges. So before, Monessen, Denora, and Charleroi all had independent lodges. And he realized that there just weren't enough people to support that. So he created a lodge that had members from all 3 of those towns. And because B'nai B'rith was not religious, he was able to sidestep the big problem that the synagogues had, which was figuring out who was going to have to walk on Shabbat and who was going to be able to stay home. Because B'nai B'rith wasn't meeting on Saturday, he was able to avoid that. You can see that there was another lodge that they created for what they called the entire Beaver Valley. I don't know how far they're considering, but let's say at least Beaver Falls and probably New Brighton and maybe Rochester. And you can see that he did the same thing with Katanning and Forge City, where he found that these 2 towns, between the 2 of them, had enough people to support a lodge. And then this thing on the side here is just a piece from the Rauh archives, from his family's collection, about a meeting that he was holding in New Kensington, just to give you a sense of kind of the tone and spirit of those meetings at that time. The 1920s saw no new, well, not none, but very few new lodges locally. But a lot was happening nationally in the 1920s. The big thing that happened nationally was that B'nai B'rith got a new president who was their first president of Eastern European ancestry. So the original founders and members had all been German Jews. And one of the things this new president did was he created a youth structure for B'nai B'rith. So for boys, it was AZA, and for girls, it was BBG. we recently got records from Beth Israel in Washington, and there was this wonderful book in there, very old book, that was looking at AZA chapters. So the first AZA chapter was in Omaha, Nebraska, but the 24th was in Canonsburg. So the first AZA chapter in Western Pennsylvania was not in the city, it was in Canonsburg. And I think this really is a very telling detail that the communities that first picked up on the potential of AZA were the small towns. Because in the city, I think there was a lot of options for Jewish kids, but in the small towns, there really was much less. And so the towns understood that if each of these towns started an AZA chapter, started a BBG chapter, that they could then meet up with other AZA and BBG chapters in other towns. And suddenly you could start to have a pretty large community of Jewish children that covered the whole region. The fourth wave of B'nai B'rith lodges was between 1935 and 1941. And you can see again that they're having to go back to towns. So again, Denora, Charleroi are back now with their third attempts in those towns. There was a lodge called the Tri-Town Lodge, which was originally the Connellsville-Scottdale Lodge. They ended up adding, I believe, Jeanette to that at some point, which is how it got to be Tri-Town. The Kiski Valley, so that was Apollo, Leechburg, and Vandergrift, got one together. And then they even were going into some really small communities, like in Kane, where there was probably less than 100 Jews in the whole town, but they managed to start a B'nai B'rith lodge there. During that time in the late 30s and early 40s is when B'nai B'rith women really started to take off. And you can see in Pittsburgh that starting in 38, you start to see this rush of B'nai B'rith women. They were originally called auxiliaries, and then I think they became chapters at some point. Interestingly, it does not seem that the small towns picked up on B'nai B'rith women as quickly. And the best theory I can come up with is that in the small towns, the synagogue was the center of Jewish social life. And these synagogues all had sisterhoods already. National Council of Jewish Women had gotten to the towns earlier. And so there was often National Council of Jewish Women chapters. Sometimes there were Hadassah chapters. And so I think it took a while for these communities to grow to the point where they could support a fourth Jewish women's organization in the form of B'nai B'rith women. So this is the charter from the B'nai B'rith women chapter in Monessen, which was chapter 199, I believe. And you can see the list of names there. The next wave came between 1947 and 1949. And this was part of a big push led by Sammy Weiss of Glassport to add 2,500 members to the Western Pennsylvania and West Virginia B'nai B'rith. So some of that growth they did through existing lodges, but others they did by going into small towns and starting new chapters. And so you can see that a lot of these are new. They're ones that we hadn't seen yet before. There's some that we have. And some of them are in very small communities like Brownsville. Phillipsburg was a very tiny community. In Elizabeth, PA, probably had 2 or 3 Jewish families at one point. So you can see them by this point in 1947, they've really spread across the whole state. This is an image I found in one of the B'nai B'rith scrapbooks, just to give you a sense of kind of the size of the B'nai B'rith movement during this time in the late 40s. And then this is a wonderful program from a Western Pennsylvania Council convention that was held in Newcastle in 1947. And it's great because it has this list of all of the chapters, all of the lodges in Western Pennsylvania at that time. And so you can see that in Pittsburgh, of this list, I think 2 or maybe 3 of these are Pittsburgh, and then all the rest of them are small towns. As you go down the list, you see that there are towns listed, and then there's also names like Eliezer Katz or Marshall Haas. And that was part of a trend that B'nai B'rith, I don't know if B'nai B'rith launched this or if the towns launched this, but the idea was that communities could rename their lodge after a local figure that they particularly admired. So Eleazar Katz was the Jeanette Lodge, and he was an old timer in the community who was particularly respected. But one of the things that you notice as you start to go through the list is that a lot of them were named after soldiers, many of whom were killed in action. Sometimes they weren't. They came back and they were kind of respected veterans. But it's an interesting feature. I haven't looked in other towns to see if that's the case there as well. I would imagine that it was. So this period, starting in the late 40s and really into the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, is the peak period for B'nai B'rith nationally and also in Western Pennsylvania. And I just wanted to find some pictures that I thought would evoke the spirit of that time. And hopefully it's something that resonates with those of you who were involved with B'nai B'rith during that time. So this is from the Warren Roy Laufey Lodge in Greensburg. And it's just it's a bowling league banquet, but this picture of all these guys, some of them wearing neckties, some of them in their shirt sleeves, I think really captures something about the spirit of that time and the way the social involvement of it. There was also, of course, a philanthropic side to it. And so this is that same lodge going to the children's home in Greensburg to do a hot dog roast for the kids there. And then going through the Temple Beth El records in Bradford recently, I found this wonderful skit that came from the B'nai B'rith Women Minute book there. This was written by one of the B'nai B'rith women leaders. And it's a skit about why people should join B'nai B'rith women. And it's got these two characters. One is Lillian, describes her as a wealthy, pampered, city-dwelling homemaker. And the other is Zelda, who is an ultra-smart, successful career woman. And it's just a great look at kind of the stereotypes of the time. And then, of course, there is the youth activities. So this is a great photograph of one of the Beaver Valley AZA in 1959, really the heyday of AZA activity. And then I found this wonderful booklet that we have in the archives explaining the rituals. There was kind of not quite Masonic, but there was a big part of AZA was these rituals and the orders and the hierarchy of who was in charge and the names and all that sort of tradition that went around it as well. This was from a welcome party when the Grand Aleph Gadol came to Pittsburgh in the late 1950s. And there was a welcome party for him at the Y in Pittsburgh. And this would have brought together AZAs from throughout the region. So there would have been, you can't tell unless you recognize the faces, but this is both Pittsburgh and small town. And then, of course, while the boys were doing AZA, the girls were doing BBG. And these are two wonderful photographs that we have from the Winnett BBG, which brought together young women from Irwin and Jeanette. And this is in the mid-1940s. It really gives you a sense of kind of the vibrancy of these organizations at that time. And then just kind of looking over that time period, the regional directors were really important figures at that time. And when they were good, they really added a lot to the whole enterprise. And so I just thought it would be interesting to have this list looking particularly at the late 40s into the 1960s, at some of the people who were leading B'nai B'rith at that time, and especially BBYO. And the three best known were probably Cy Cohen, Earl Yalen, and then Marshall Gordon, who not only was the head of it for a long time, but was local to the small towns as well. In the 80s, 90s, and then beyond, B'nai B'rith continued to be a force in the region, but it was definitely starting to shrink. And you start to see during these years a consolidation. So after the 1950s, there are really no new lodges created in the small towns, with the exception of, I think there was Altoona and Johnstown might have had new lodges. But beyond that, everything else was a continuation of existing lodges. And what you start to see in a lot of towns is that B'nai B'rith is kind of part of a menu of Jewish organizations. So this is a Jewish community book from Oil City, but it's including surrounding towns of Franklin, Titusville, Clarion, and New Bethlehem. By the early 90s, none of those towns had synagogues except for Oil City. So Oil City became kind of the center of activity. And then at some point, the entire Northwest kind of consolidated into its own region. And so this is from a directory that we have, and you can get a sense, this is actually a little bit earlier in the 70s, you get a sense of kind of the breadth of activities that were going on, and both in terms of the types of activities and in terms of geography. And then I wanted to end with this little story I found in a book published by the JCC, because I feel like it really captures a lot of what made the AZA, BBYO, BBG, and B'nai B'rith as a whole really special. So this is from Burnett Weinswig, and he says, in the early 1940s, the Uniontown AZA basketball team would play in an IKC league, that's the Irene Kaufman Center League. On one of the rides to Pittsburgh, we were delayed in traffic. As darkness approached, it became evident that it was time for evening prayers. Our driver, the rabbi, told us to gather on the side of the road near the cars. With the rabbi swaying back and forth, the basketball team hiding behind the cars from the gazes of all the Christians passing by in their cars on Route 51, we prayed. I think that captures a lot about the excitement of kind of the kids like getting together and traveling somewhere, the interplay between the fun social side of B'nai B'rith and the religious side, and then that feeling of kind of Jews being in the minority and kind of huddling together in order to make their numbers matter more. So I think I'll stop there. And I'm happy to, I see we've got a bunch of things in the chat. I'm happy to take any questions that people have. I will say one other thing before we go to questions. I have found that in the archive, as I was looking for materials, I found that there was a lot fewer B'nai B'rith materials from the small towns than I had expected, that a lot of the materials that we have are from the cities. And the theory that I have is that because B'nai B'rith was not necessarily based in synagogues, it was that the records may have been kept individually. And so a lot of those records have not come to us. And so before we go to questions, I'll just put out this call that if you do have B'nai B'rith material from the towns, we would love to add those to the archives. So with that, we can open it up to questions. I see you have your hand raised.
So it's not so much a question, Eric, but kind of a point of information that so many of us that are on this call were in BBYO starting at age 14 through high school. So it would have been the 60s and early 70s. And that was so much a basis of our Jewish life was BBG and AZA, and we all went to district conventions, and we had our program weekends every month or every other month. And it was so rich, and many of us that are on this call are still in touch and still friends today. So it was so much a fabric of our lives, and now I have to remember to send you a bunch of pictures.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, that's the sense that you always get when you talk to people, especially in the small towns, is I think somebody sent me an email this week. She described it as a lifeline, that you were in this town that you might have a very small Jewish population, but BBYO opened it up so that you were able to have this large Jewish network.
Joyce Gendler, do you want to share what you put in the chat? Unmute yourself.
Okay, the people read the chat. Okay, I belong to the Butler Synagogue, which is the only one between Pittsburgh and Erie. And I also belong to a synagogue and Philadelphia. And let's see, but the neighbors used to have conventions every summer. And the last one was like 1993, when they changed from councils to these giant districts, like 3 states make a district. And they asked my husband to be president of a district, but he was only 53, not old enough to retire from this job. Okay.
Thank you.
You're
Thank you.
welcome.
Jeffrey Marlin?
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. I'm a product of B'nai B'rith or AZA in that my parents met because of AZA and BBG. At that time, AZA was more like a fraternity. My father was already out of high school when he was part of AZA. He was preparing for an international AZA convention in debating. They went to practice in Butler, where he met my mother. My father was from Newcastle. And so I am a product from that liaison, so to speak. So BBYO, B'nai B'rith, however you want to put it, is why I'm here.
Thank you. Eric, why do you think B'nai B'rith chapters are in decline? So many communities no longer have any, or if they do have it, it's just maybe to have a bowling league or something. What do you think the reason is?
I might be the person on this call who has the least amount of information about that, but from my outside point of view, I think some of it is that clubs generally are not as popular as they used to be. I think that some of it is just that the numbers have declined, and some of it I think is probably not local at all. It's probably national, but the changes that B'nai B'rith made to its own structure probably discouraged some of it. I'd be very curious to hear what people on the call think about the reasons why.
I would say in my case, I'm not in the same community I grew up in. I carried the same feelings with me, and I found individual places to put my efforts rather than just through Jewish communities. So I didn't have to look for a Jewish community to do that. I found others.
Thank you,
In
Lee.
California.
My name is Herbert Grossman,
Yes, Herbert.
Butler, Pennsylvania. I'm almost 90, and I do remember very, very distinctly having B'nai B'rith basketball tournaments in Beaver Falls, Newcastle, Butler, in which we used to take the AZA basketball tournaments, and we used to have 2 or 3 places running at the same time at basketball. It was quite active here at that time.
Thank you. Eric, have you collected information about the reform youth? We were talking about BBYO, but what about with NIFTY or USY? There's similar, I guess, impact on the Jewish community with those as with BBYO?
People can tell me if I have this wrong, but my understanding is that the synagogue-based youth groups were more active in the city than the small towns. We have a few records from small town like USYs, but what I think B'nai B'rith started, I don't know if they were the first. National Council of Jewish Women might have been the first, but they really pioneered this regional hierarchical model where you had a regional council that then broke down into sub-regionals and then into local lodges that allowed this, it created this web of connections. And I just don't get the sense that the synagogue-based youth movements really did that in the same way outside of Pittsburgh. I don't know if it was just because the small towns could only support so many organizations, or if it's because the denominational life was so in flux. You had congregations that kind of were Orthodox and then moving towards conservative. I don't know what the story was, but my sense just from the records is that NIFTY and USY were not as big in the small towns as BBYO was.
Larry Ellison, unmute yourself.
I grew up in Bradford and lived there for, I don't know, till we moved to Atlanta in '85. But Rabbi Alan Levine, after the Reform and conservative synagogues merged, he was very instrumental in getting the youth to join NELFD. Went to a lot of conventions, but prior to that, bowling was a big thing for my generation's parents. Traveled all over to the B'nai B'rith bowling tournaments, which I never went, but remember my father and several other community members going to the bowling tournaments. But NELFD was big in Bradford, and the congregation at that point, from probably 1960 to maybe 1975, there was probably 60 Jewish families that supported B'nai B'rith and NELFD.
Thank you. Karen, unmute yourself.
Yep. Yeah, I was going to say, for me, growing up in the 70s and 80s, I think B'nai B'rith was not quite the same force that it was, a generation prior. And I think part of that even has to do a little bit just with our integration into society. I think there was a little less anti-Semitism and there wasn't quite the sense that we weren't accepted by others, and so we needed to be tight within ourselves. And so I think I suspect actually that decreases in anti-Semitism also led to decreases in B'nai B'rith.
Thank you. Lynn.
So I was going to address Eric a little bit. I mean, I can't recall Sharon, Newcastle, Beaver Falls, New Kensington, Aliquippa, those cities that were all in the Northwest Council ever having any kind of real other Jewish youth group presence. But I think, part of the deterioration is we all know that the Jewish population has been decreasing and diminishing. So most definitely in the small towns where we've seen a lot of the synagogues closing. But what I find interesting is the handful of people that I know in this call, we were all in BBYO, but I don't think any of us kept our alliance or our membership with B'nai B'rith as adults. I don't know why not. I mean, I'm not sure why. I don't know if we just weren't marketed to, but it never even occurred to me to become an adult member. Although I'm just going to say one more thing. I was very heartened. My son's now 32. He was in 10th grade and we were living in San Diego, and he came home and said, do you mind if I join AZA? I met a bunch of really nice guys. That's fine, go right ahead. So it was really cool to see him be active. And then of course it was my turn to house a bunch of kids overnight the way that my parents used to.
My friends insisted that I join AZA because I was the only one that could drive. So I was the one that drove everybody to every place. Toby, unmute yourself.
Hi, I grew up in Denora, PA, and presently live in Texas. But I joined BBG in 1952, and I went up the ranks. I was a Mon Valley chapter president of BBG, Tri-Valley Council president of BBG, and a District 3 officer. And a matter of fact, I was in one of the pictures that you just showed
Oh, cool.
about the BBG, well, AZA BBG preparing for a event. And BBG was my lifeline. Because of growing up in a small town in Denora, which most of the Jews were in my age group, you're younger or you know, some older, were my relatives. And so BBG really, ended up meeting people from all over the world through BBG and my active in it really was a lifeline. And I'm proud to say that my granddaughter, I live in a small area in Texas, and my granddaughter is a BBG member. My mom was real active in B'nai B'rith, and even as she was in her 80s, she still belonged to that wasn't really active, you know, in B'nai B'rith women at that point in time. So it was a definite lifeline for me.
Thank you. Jeffrey Marlin, unmute.
Yes, just one more comment in respect to what Lynn had said, who grew up with basically. But after I returned to I'm in the Newcastle area, I did become involved in B'nai B'rith. As I put in the chat, I was president of the local lodge in all the steps forward. I was also a past president of the Western Pennsylvania Council of B'nai B'rith. I was a recipient of the Label Cats Young Leadership for the international organization back in the late 80s when I was still young enough to qualify. And so I felt it was almost an obligation to repay what B'nai B'rith had given to BBYO, which was such a substantial part of my youth. It was every weekend being with other Jewish kids, which we couldn't just do in Newcastle.
Thank you. Anybody have any other final comments or questions? Marilyn Posner, unmute, please.
Hi, Toby was talking about all the relatives in Denora. She's my first cousin. My grandparents, my parents were all involved with B'nai B'rith and B'nai B'rith women. I was in BBG, and one thing that I remember was that we went to camp, BBG camp in Starlight, PA, which was a great opportunity to have all these girls around you for a whole week. And that was just wonderful. And when we moved to Washington, my husband became regional president of B'nai B'rith here. So it kept on going, but I have a lot of wonderful memories from BBG.
And I want to reiterate what Eric said is, in addition to your memories, if you have memorabilia, please let Eric know. And even if Eric, if they want to keep the original, can they make a copy or something like that, so that at least you, or at least let you know what they have?
Yeah, I mean, we always prefer the original, but our goal is to understand the extent of this. So let's start with just understanding what people have, and we can go from there.
Great. Any other final comments or questions? Before I turn it back to Doris, I have one question for Eric, but anybody? Eric, if this group wanted to invite you back again, what would be some topics that you would think that they may like to hear?
I don't have any off the top of my head, but I could go and look. I also, if anybody has stuff that you guys want to hear, I'm happy to poke into the archives. We, at this point, have records from, we have probably 25 congregational records and records of some sort from 75 to 150 towns. So anything you as a group want, we could probably put together a talk about.
I'm curious, with everything that's going on in Israel today with judicial review and all sorts of stuff. Maybe, but interest is what was the relationship between small town communities and the whole Zionist experience?
That would be a great one if that people would be interested in that. I know that Israel Bonds did something very similar to B'nai B'rith in terms of having chapters, or I don't know if chapters is the right word, but a presence in all of these towns.
Great, great, thank you. Doris?
Yeah, I think we'd all love to have you back, Eric. And thank you so much for an enlightening, interesting, and thorough presentation. This concludes this evening's program. Information about the April 27th program will be forthcoming. And thank you all for attending this program this evening. Good evening.
Thanks, Doris. Thanks, Noah.
night.
Thank you all.